You walk into this first Iron Man film not quite knowing what to expect.
At this point, comic book movies were...
You actually go outside in these things? What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
And...
I'm Batman.
But how fundamental were Dan's decisions in helping to shape the MCU? This is the first in a series of videos where I'm going to be de-editing sequences from films and showing you the process of how different decisions can affect your experience in the film for better or worse. And in this case, how the MCU was built or destroyed in its first 3 minutes.
Hello, I'm Ben, I'm a video editor, and today I'm going to be breaking down the opening scene to Iron Man. Now essentially the opening sequence to Iron Man has 3 parts. So you have the driving through the desert with the Funby, the attack, and the cave scene where Tony finds himself captive. If you look at the original cut of this sequence, it was actually quite a bit longer. There was a lot more footage of the external battle and then also more footage of the captors. Now of course this is a team effort between the storyboard artists, the director, the cinematographer, the camera operators, and it's not just Dan, our editor. On Iron Man there's 19 people in the editorial department alone. Everyone's pulling together to help craft this vision, but ultimately the last pair of hands it passes through is the editor. He can undo all that work by inserting extra shots of missiles flying, guns being shot, and take it away from Tony and make it more about the spectacle rather than the character. And what I really loved about Iron Man as a film was that it was a character-driven movie. There is some spectacle to be had, but it's character-driven. Iron Man is notable in my opinion for a couple of things. The opening sequence, when you look at it retrospectively across the MCU, there's no music over the intro, there's no Marvel fanfare, there's no Paramount fanfare, and the opening shot in Afghanistan is silent. And already you're drawn in by the editing choice to keep things quiet. The opening sequence progresses through the wide, medium and close-up rule. I learned in editing that if you cut from a wide shot to a close-up shot, it's very impactful, especially on a large 40-foot cinema screen. And so you notice that we progress from very wide, the convoy is very small, to then a long lens shot where the convoy can be seen moving towards camera, and then we're kind of riding along with one of the cars. And then we get to a soldier inside, and he's kind of got that, oh, this is interesting, look on his face. Interestingly, they put the reaction shot first, rather than Tony's hand holding his glass of whiskey. I'm presuming whiskey. I don't drink whiskey. I don't drink at all. For all I know, it's root beer. I do like root beer. This guy has status. I think it's critical that the conversation that takes place inside the Funby is only shown from inside. Why would that be important? As soon as you start breaking the confines of the scene, i.e. you put the camera outside the Funby, perhaps you take it out wide again, you then kind of open the scene back up. You as an audience start trying to process, oh, where are they now, what are they doing, as opposed to what is being said. And in this moment we're trying to set up the character of Tony Stark. We're setting up his alcoholism, his floozy nature, and the ego that he has. And what Dan's done very well is he's not done anything fancy with the editing. The only time you really cut away for reactions in this scene is to see them laugh at a punchline. MCU films of course are renowned for their humour, their quips especially from Tony. In this first minute we're getting permission to laugh. Now I remember growing up seeing deleted scenes from Star Wars. I was like, why would you cut this? I want more Star Wars. I really wanted to see that deleted scene in the movie. The opening sequence at Iron Man has a lot of action, but it's anchored around Tony Stark. It's not about the battle. If you go back through the footage and watch, there's actually only one shot that doesn't really feature Tony Stark. I think it's exceptionally frugal and also clever. Dan has chosen to keep almost every single shot about Tony. Now at this moment we know from later in the movie that Rhodey is riding in the convoy. We don't see him in this opening sequence. Now I think it's interesting that when we cut to the explosion we see it in 3 stages. We see it from inside, a medium shot and then to a wide shot, and that takes place in all about a second or 2 seconds. In the extended cut you can see that there's a lot more of the battle and there's some cool shots. There are several recent movies renowned for having action going on far too long. So what was changed and why on earth does it matter? Now, if the editor had been wrapped up in looking at the cool perspective of mounting a camera to the side of the barrel, or if he wanted to focus more on the battle, we don't know these troops. All we really care about is this one person, Tony. I think Dan made the right decision by cutting out that footage.
Now, I do have to pick apart these couple of shots where Tony gets blown up by his own missile. You may not notice, but if you freeze frame, you can see that the missile isn't actually the right shape and doesn't have the fins or the Stark Industries marking on the side. Something that is quite noticeable is the fact that the smoke trail doesn't line up with the proper missile that's in the ground. Also, where's the dirt that's been thrown up from the impact? This isn't so much something that you can fix in editing if that's the only way it was shot. You just have to try and cut around it. Now for this shot, they used a different take for the finished sequence than they did in the original cut. The original take has Robert move in a different way, and there's no finished blood visual effects. Now this CGI blood kind of took me out of the moment in the cinema. It just wasn't very good. This isn't the editor's fault. This is the better take to use, in my opinion, because the camera movement is simpler. It's not rotating and you can focus more on the blood, even if I don't like the visual effects so much. Also, the placement of the sun shot in the sequence changed. In the original version, Tony hits the ground and it immediately cuts to the sun. Then it cuts back to him realizing that he's bleeding to death. In the finished sequence, you get one longer take of Tony slowly realizing he's bleeding to death, and then we have a nice double transition. First, we start transitioning to the sun, and then it transitions into the light that's beaming into Tony's face in the cave. This is a match cut transition. A match cut is where you line up two elements in different scenes and then make a transition out of them. By moving this sun shot to be part of this transition, it implies that the cave light is just as strong and glaring as the actual sun, and it adds weight to Tony's wince. Another trick in the editor's arsenal is to cut mid-action. The second transition is when the sack is started to be pulled off of Tony's head and cuts mid-action to his head and shoulders shot. And so in the sequence of 4 shots, we have a double transition that helps just continue the flow of the sequence really nicely, as opposed to the original cut. Also, the arrangement of these shots in the original cut is slightly different, but in the finished version, you linger more on Tony's reaction first before seeing more of the cave.
The next part of the sequence really brings home the stark, no pun intended, nature of Tony's predicament. We see a shot of the camera operator, and then we cut back to the wide shot that pulls out. Now, in the extended scene, we see more of the reading out of the message that we later see in the Stark office. Now, again, nothing really fancy has been happening with the camera. The fancy camera moves being attached to the tank, for example, in the extended scene, have been cut. This is the most dynamic move that we get in the sequence so far, and that is a pull-out. Very effective. One of the things I'm not a great fan of is Bayhem. So that's Michael Bay's style of shooting and editing when you really just can't tell what's going on. Something that you can learn from Peter Jackson while watching the Two Towers Helm's Deep sequence is how there's only perhaps about 3 shots before you cut back to main characters. When Tony gets out, there's 2 or 3 shots of him running across the desert to the rock. The important thing is being able to show the terrain and be able to follow the geography as you go through the shot. Generally in action scenes, for example, Attack of the Clones, all the droids are attacking from screen left to screen right, but all the clones are attacking from screen right to screen left, and that is kept up throughout the whole sequence. Here it doesn't, I don't think, faze anybody.
By choosing to cut out a lot of the action, both from the army and from Tony, everything happens fast, and people start dropping like flies, and the audience gets a lot more worried that things are going south as opposed to just an action scene. In the finished sequence, he just gets out of the car and heads for cover, but in the original cut, he picks up a gun and tries to join in the action. When he discovers, though, that his gun doesn't work, he does curse and he F-bombs. Personally, I'm glad they dropped the F-bomb because that would have shifted the tone of all the MCU. This helps to shift the audience's reaction, though, because Tony isn't standing to make a fight, he's just trying to run and get out of there, and it helps add to the intensity as everything happens so quickly. And this is one of the big takeaways. By condensing the sequence, things happen faster, the audience has less time to react, and before you know it, your main character is a hostage, and he's pretty powerless.
So what effect does this particular cut have on the flow and the story of the movie? Now, it's quite a jarring edit going from the opening title of Tony's been captured to then, oh look, we're at a corporate dinner watching a slideshow, yay! We then get into a lot of exposition. So it's like you've had your fun hook. So the hook is what captures the audience's attention, much like a pre-roll ad on a trailer. They give you like 6 seconds, like, hey, we're going to show you the trailer. Like, I know, I clicked on the trailer. It should feel brief. Now, this sequence lasts about 3.5 to 4 minutes, depending if you're counting the opening logos, before we get into the story reset back in Las Vegas. And then you spend another good, I think, 20 minutes before you actually get back into the desert again. Now, imagine if they'd had that sequence in order of the movie's continuity. You would have started in Las Vegas. Is that much of an exciting opening? No, I mean, it's fun seeing the scene where Tony is rolling the dice. It's like, yep, working. But this is definitely a much stronger opening. In fact, I'm hard-pressed to think of a more captivating opening. I mean, A New Hope, certainly up there, but you have to get past a minute or two's worth of text crawl. One of the things I don't particularly like in films is reading. By having the sequence take place at the beginning of the movie, you then have a sense of tension throughout the first act before you get back to the desert again. Now, if you remove that sequence and just play it in chronological order of how it would have happened, the first act just wouldn't have had that drive, that impetus. You know that something's going to happen. You then don't want to spend all that much time getting back to the desert, and there are several scenes where they have either removed parts of or full scenes. For example, there's one particular scene where Tony and Rhodey are on the jet enjoying more of the girls dancing, and then there's also the scene where Tony arrives and you see Rhodey and he's like, hungover, headache. And then also there's like a procession of troops welcoming Tony, and it was kind of boring to watch. By removing and trimming scenes that sort of harp on about the same point for too long, you're able to give enough exposition, enough character setup so that you're not dwelling and boring the audience. If you think about it, the second unit would have spent a long time shooting the extra battle sequence, and they would have paid a lot of money, set up all the explosions, so probably a couple of days worth of filming, and yet they decided to take it out. Was it the right call? Yes. Now, it's fascinating to go back and see the extended cut of this sequence. There is more battle, there is more in the cave. Do we need it? No, and that's the test of an editor. If you cut it out, do you miss it? Have you missed character development, important plot points? No? Then you didn't need it. Sometimes the rule of cool overrides and you get long, gratuitous sunset shots or sweeping camera angles that look cool on their own, but it's not telling you anything. Camera movement should be motivated. The only camera movement we really get in any of these scenes is the pullback, the very last shot from Tony's face to the wider shot of the 10 Rings flag and the terrorist, and really hammers home the realization he's been held hostage. Because all the preceding shots were very still, very locked off, sometimes a little handheld, it means that when we do get some movement in the shot, you really notice it.
If you as a viewer were not emotionally invested by the time the first few minutes were over, you wouldn't be emotionally invested by the end of the movie, which means you wouldn't care about telling your friends, people wouldn't go see the movie, and it's quite likely if that had underperformed, then they would have scaled back post-production on The Incredible Hulk. We wouldn't have had a sequel, we wouldn't have had the Avengers. If you don't buy into the conflict in the Avengers, we wouldn't have got to Endgame, and that would have been a crime. The first three phases of the MCU as we know it hinge entirely around Iron Man. Even a film like Captain America Civil War is really about Iron Man. If you don't care about Tony, then you don't care about the climax of Endgame. You don't care about the beginning of Endgame where he's lost in space, floating and about to die. If you don't care about Tony, then you don't really care that he's training a teenager with a killer suit.
And if you died, I feel like that's on me. I just wanted to be like you. And I wanted you to be better.
The MCU stands or dies on Iron Man. And if Iron Man's opening sequence didn't work, then the MCU would have stalled. Then plans for the Avengers simply wouldn't have happened.
So, how do we rate Iron Man now that we have de-edited it? For me, it's a clean cut. Now, if you want to help me pick the next movie sequence that I de-edit, let me know, because I haven't decided yet. In the meantime, thanks for watching.